William Shakespeare here to explain views about life in the trenches. Firstly, there's the views about the soldiers being constantly bombed out or shelled at. This view is true to an extent. For example, in the Battle of Somme, 1,738,000 shells were fired at the Germans. But there was also this thing called the rotation system, which meant that the soldiers weren't at the front line for too long, and the soldiers actually spent more than 60% of their time behind the front lines. Second is the horrific and unhygienic conditions of the trenches. There were problems such as lice, rats, trench foot, getting gassed, rotten corpses, no proper toilets, sleeping on the floor. But generally, the army worked to get rid of these problems. For example, the men's uniforms were fumigated, ironed, and washed when they came out of line, which meant they got rid of all the lice. For trench foot, the soldiers got thigh-high waders and whale oil to keep their feet protected. And later on during the war, there were efforts to drain the trenches using mechanical pumps. The next view is about patriotic volunteers. Of course, there was a lot of propaganda in World War I. By the end of 1915, nearly 2 million people signed up for the war. Some men signed up for the experience, they wanted the challenge, they wanted the danger. When the men got there, they actually were there for comradeship. They made friends, they stuck to each other, they helped out each other. But there was also a lot of pressure put on the young men of that time to join the war. Firstly, they felt like they had to protect their family, their wives, their children. They had to do something for their country, patriotism, and they were actually shamed if they didn't join the war. Women would pass out white feathers to people who weren't in uniform as a sign of cowardice. Next is the stupid generals. General Haig led 620,000 people to their deaths, 60,000 just on the first day of the Battle of Somme. There's a popular view that the generals were really uncaring about the soldiers, they just led them to their deaths. The generals were always protected, they were somewhere safe while the soldiers were out there fighting. This wasn't always true. In the war, 4 British lieutenant generals, 12 major generals, and 81 brigadier generals died. 146 were injured or wounded and taken prisoners. General Haig was actually another example. He was actually quite popular. He worked 15 hours a day. It wasn't always just them sitting back and then sending all the men to their deaths. Next is the poor diet. Those things like shortages of food, their water was carried in petroleum tanks, so they were basically drinking acid, which is dangerous for them. But especially the British army, they got really good food. They got tin food, eggs, bacon, tea. They got 6 pints a day. They got corned beef, fresh meat, biscuits, cigarettes. The average soldier got 4,000 calories per day, which is actually more than an average grown male would need now. The soldiers actually gained weight and height when they went to war because they were getting fed really, really well. Next is the strict army discipline. There were severe punishments for things like refusing to fight, punching an officer, falling asleep during watch and stuff. But usually the accused officers were offered a defending officer, and a lot of the death sentences were actually suspended or changed to imprisonment or field punishments. There were 15 soldiers who were sentenced for cowardice and 449 who were sentenced for sleeping in a purse. But out of that 449, only 2 of the executions were carried out. So there was a lot of punishment, but it wasn't as bad as it seems. In my opinion, I believe that life in the trenches was neutral. It wasn't amazing, but it wasn't too bad either. There were cases where the conditions were really bad, the popular belief seems to be really true. But then there were also cases which isn't so popular, where the trenches were actually okay. The guys, they were all friends, some people actually describe the trenches to be fun. So I'd say the trenches weren't too bad, but they weren't too good.